Close your eyes and let me take you to a place where the Mediterranean sun kisses ancient stone, where the salt air carries whispers of heroes long gone. Picture a narrow pass between towering cliffs and restless sea, where the earth itself seems to remember the weight of bronze shields and the thunder of 10,000 hearts beating as one. This is Thermopylae, the hot gates, a place where time stands still, where the ghosts of warriors walk eternally in the morning mist. Tonight, we journey back 25 centuries to 3 days that would echo through eternity, to a story written in blood and honor upon the scrolls of immortality. Here, beneath the weight of destiny, 300 Spartan warriors chose to stand against the tide of history itself. Their shields caught the dying light like mirrors of bronze. Their spears pointed toward an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Indus, from the Caspian Sea to the gates of Greece itself. But before we begin this journey into the realm of legends, subscribe to the Dreaming of Past channel. Then leave a comment and tell us what other fascinating stories you'd love to hear whispered into the night. Now, dim the lights. Let the world around you fade. Close your eyes and listen only to the sound of my voice as we walk together through the corridors of time, toward a beach where heroes were born and legends were carved into the very stones of eternity. The year is 480 BCE, and the greatest empire the world has ever known is marching toward the cradle of democracy itself. In the pre-dawn darkness of a Persian morning, when the stars still hung like scattered diamonds over the vast expanse of the Hellespont, an empire stirred. Imagine, if you will, the gentle lapping of waves against 1,000 ships, their hulls creaking softly in the harbor like sleeping giants. The air carried the scent of cedar and bronze, of horses and leather, of 1,000,000 souls gathered beneath the banner of one man who called himself the King of Kings, Xerxes. His name alone could silence a room, could bend the knee of satraps who ruled lands larger than kingdoms. When he walked, the earth seemed to tremble not from his footsteps, but from the weight of destiny that followed in his wake. His empire stretched like a vast tapestry across the known world, woven from the threads of conquered nations, each thread a different color, a different tongue, a different dream surrendered to his will. But tonight, as we drift through the corridors of memory, we must understand that Xerxes was not merely a conqueror. He was a man haunted by the ghost of Marathon, where 10 years before his father Darius had tasted the bitter wine of defeat at the hands of the Athenians. That wound had festered in the royal heart, growing like a cancer of pride and vengeance, until it consumed the very soul of the Persian throne. The morning sun rose over the Hellespont, painting the waters gold and crimson, and revealed a sight that would have stopped the breath of gods themselves. 1,000,000 men, they said, though perhaps the number lived more in legend than in truth. Yet even if half that number, or a quarter, the army that stretched along the shore was like nothing the world had ever seen. Immortals in their scaled armor, their faces hidden behind masks of bronze and gold. Scythian archers with their curved bows, their arrows sharp as winter wind. War elephants from the distant lands of India, their tusks gleaming like ivory towers in the morning light. And the ships. Oh, the ships. They darkened the sea like a forest of masts, their sails billowing in the morning breeze, like the wings of 1,000 sleeping birds. Phoenician vessels with their purple sails, Egyptian galleys with eyes painted on their prows to see through the darkness of the deep, ships from every corner of the empire, each one carrying the dreams and fears of men who had left their homes to serve the will of the great king. But as Xerxes stood upon his golden throne, watching the sun rise over his assembled might, something stirred in the wind. A whisper, perhaps, or merely the echo of distant thunder. For across the wine-dark sea, in the rocky hills of Greece, Another kind of army was stirring. Not millions, but hundreds. Not an empire, but a handful of city-states bound together by something more fragile and more powerful than conquest. The wild, untamed dream of freedom. The Persian host moved like a river of bronze and flesh, flowing through the passes of Thrace, across the bridges that spanned the Hellespont, like the very fingers of the gods. Each step brought them closer to Greece, closer to the reckoning that had been written in the stars since the world was young. And as they marched, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when the unstoppable force of empire would meet the immovable object of Greek defiance. But let us not think of this as merely a tale of war. No, this is a story of the human heart, of the choices that define us when the darkness gathers and the easy path beckons like a siren's song. For in the Persian camp, as in the Greek, there walked men who loved their wives and children, who dreamed of home and harvest, who carried in their hearts the same hopes and fears that beat in every mortal breast. The night deepened over the Persian camp, and 10,000 fires flickered like earthbound stars. In the royal tent, Xerxes lay upon cushions of silk and gold, but sleep eluded him like a phantom. For in his dreams he heard the whisper of the oracle at Delphi, the cryptic words that had reached even his distant throne. When the Persian dares to span the sacred waters with a bridge of boats, then will the gods awaken to punish the hubris of mortal men. Yet pride, that most beautiful and terrible of human failings, had closed his ears to wisdom. The bridges had been built, the sacred waters spanned, and now the die was cast. The great king had chosen his path, and all the world would tremble beneath the weight of his decision. As the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, neither Xerxes nor his sleeping army could know that far to the south. In a small mountain city where warriors were bred like wolves, a man named Leonidas was sharpening his spear and preparing to write his name in letters of fire across the pages of eternity. The shadow of the great king stretched across the world, but somewhere in the darkness, a smaller shadow was stirring. A shadow that would soon stand in the narrow pass called Thermopylae, where the fate of the world would be decided not by the size of armies, but by the depth of courage that beats in the hearts of free men. In the heart of the Peloponnese, where the mountains bite the sky with teeth of stone and the valleys run red with wildflowers, there stood a city unlike any other in the world, Sparta. Even the name fell from the lips like the edge of a blade, sharp and unforgiving, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Picture, if you will, the early morning light filtering through the olive groves, casting long shadows across the training grounds, where boys barely old enough to hold a spear were learning the dance of war. The air rang with the clash of bronze on bronze, the sharp commands of instructors whose scars told stories of battles fought in distant lands. This was no ordinary city, where merchants hawked their wares and poets sang of love beneath the stars. This was a forge where heroes were hammered into shape upon the anvil of discipline and honor. Here, in this austere paradise of warriors, lived a man whose very presence seemed to command the respect of gods and mortals alike. Leonidas, king of Sparta, son of Anaxandrides, heir to a throne that had been won not with gold or diplomacy, but with the blood of men who refused to kneel. When he walked through the streets of his city, children stopped their games to watch him pass, not from fear, but from the same reverence they might show to a lion that had chosen to walk among sheep. But this morning, as the sun painted the mountains gold, and the air carried the scent of pine and wild thyme, Leonidas was not thinking of his throne or his crown. In his hands he held a message that had arrived with the dawn, carried by a horseman whose mount had died of exhaustion at the city gates. The words were simple, direct, written in the flowing script of the Athenian council. The Persian comes. The great king's army numbers beyond counting. We call upon Sparta to honor the ancient bonds of kinship and stand with us against the tide of empire. The message spoke of desperate alliances being forged in the shadow of approaching doom. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, calling upon Sparta, the city of warriors, to put aside their ancient rivalries and stand together against the common threat. It spoke of a plan, desperate and beautiful in its simplicity, to hold the Persian army at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where the advantage of numbers would count for nothing, where a few brave men might stand against the world itself. Leonidas read the message once, twice, then let it fall from his fingers like an autumn leaf. Around him, the city went about its morning rituals, unaware that their king was weighing the fate of Greece in the balance of his heart. The children still played their games of war, their wooden swords clicking like the bones of the dead. The women still wove their cloth in the courtyards, their songs rising like incense to the gods above. The old men still told their stories of ancient battles, their voices carrying the weight of years and wisdom. But in the king's heart, a different kind of storm was gathering. For he knew with the terrible clarity that comes to those who have stared death in the face that this was not merely a call to war. This was a summons to immortality, a chance to write his name in letters of fire across the scroll of history. Yet immortality, he understood, was a coin that could only be purchased with the currency of life itself. The oracle at Delphi had spoken, her words echoing through the marble halls of the temple like the voice of eternity itself. Either Sparta will be destroyed, or one of her kings must die. The prophecy hung over the city like a shadow, whispered in the streets and debated in the council chambers. Some claimed it was merely the ravings of a mad woman, drunk on the vapors that rose from the sacred chasm. Others believed it was the very voice of Apollo himself, speaking through mortal lips the doom that awaited them all. But Leonidas had heard something else in those cryptic words, something that made his warrior's heart sing with a terrible joy. For if one king must die to save his city, then let it be him. Let his name be the price paid for Sparta's freedom. Let his blood be the sacrifice that purchased the liberty of generations yet unborn. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Leonidas called together his council. They gathered in the great hall where the kings of Sparta had held court for centuries, their faces carved from the same stone as the statues that lined the walls. These were men who had stood with him in battle, who had shared the bread of victory and the wine of defeat, who knew the weight of command and the burden of choice. "The Persian comes," Leonidas said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had never known defeat. 1,000,000 men, they say, with ships that darken the sea and weapons that gleam like stars. They come not as conquerors, but as destroyers, seeking to grind our cities to dust and make slaves of our children. The council listened in silence, their faces reflecting the flickering light of the torches that lined the walls. Each man knew what was being asked of them, knew that the next words from their king's lips would determine not just their fate, but the fate of all Greece. "We will go to Thermopylae," Leonidas continued, his words falling like stones into still water. "We will take 300 of our finest warriors, and we will hold the pass against the tide of empire. We will show the world that free men, fighting for their homes and their honor, are worth more than 1,000 slaves driven by the whip of tyranny." The silence that followed was deeper than the grave, heavier than the mountains that surrounded their city. For each man in that room understood that they were not merely planning a battle, but a funeral. A funeral for themselves, perhaps, but also for the old world that was passing away, the world where might made right and empires devoured nations like wolves devouring sheep. But in that silence, something else stirred, something that had been sleeping in the hearts of men since the world began, waiting for the moment when courage would be called upon to stand against the darkness. It was the echo of every hero who had ever drawn breath, the whisper of every warrior who had ever raised his shield in defense of something greater than himself. And as the torches burned low and the night deepened around them, Leonidas began to speak of the 300 who would march with him to Thermopylae, to the narrow pass where legends would be born and the fate of the world would be decided by the courage of free men. The morning mist clung to the olive groves like the breath of ghosts, and through the narrow streets of Sparta, word spread like wildfire through dry grass. The king would choose his companions for the march to Thermopylae, not from the young and eager, whose hearts burned with untested fire, but from the fathers and husbands, the men who had already proven their worth in the crucible of battle, who had already given their youth to the service of their city. Picture the scene, if you will, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the mist began to lift from the training grounds. Warriors gathered in the agora, their bronze breastplates catching the light like mirrors of burnished gold. These were not the fresh-faced boys who dreamed of glory, but seasoned veterans whose eyes held the weight of years and the wisdom of scars. Men who had stood in the phalanx at Plataea, who had felt the push of shields and the bite of enemy spears, who knew that war was not a game, but a dance with death itself. Leonidas walked among them, his gaze measuring each man not by his strength or his skill with weapons, but by something deeper, something that lived in the soul rather than the flesh. For he knew that the battle they were marching toward would not be won by the strongest sword or the swiftest spear, but by the unbreakable will of men who had made peace with their mortality. The first to be chosen was Dieneces, the wit of the army, whose laughter could lighten the darkest hour and whose courage burned like a beacon in the night. When a Persian herald had boasted that their arrows would blot out the sun, Dieneces had merely smiled and replied, "Good, then we will fight in the shade." He was a man who faced death with a joke on his lips and a song in his heart, who understood that sometimes the greatest act of defiance is to laugh in the face of doom. Then came Alpheus and Maron, twin brothers who had never fought apart, whose movements in battle were like the two halves of a single soul. They stood together as they had been born, shoulder to shoulder, their eyes reflecting the same quiet determination that had carried them through a dozen battles. When Leonidas nodded toward them, they stepped forward as one, their silence more eloquent than any oath. One by one the 300 were chosen, Procles, whose father had fallen at Marathon, but whose son would carry on the family name. Theron, who had once held a bridge single-handed against a company of Athenians, not from hatred, but from the simple duty of a soldier following his orders. Nicomedes, whose hands could fashion a spear point with the precision of a master craftsman or wield a sword with the grace of a dancer. Each man who was chosen understood what was being asked of him. This was not a call to glory, but a summons to sacrifice. They would march to Thermopylae not to win a battle, but to buy time with their lives, to hold the pass long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare for the storm that was coming. They would stand like a breakwater against the tide of empire, knowing that the waves would eventually overwhelm them, but hoping that their sacrifice would spare the shore behind them. As the choosing continued, the women of Sparta watched from the shadows of the colonnades, their faces carved from the same stone as their men's hearts. These were not the soft ladies of Athens, who wept at the sight of blood and swooned at the sound of battle. These were Spartan women, who had been raised to value honor above life and courage above comfort. They would send their husbands and sons to war with a blessing on their lips and a prayer in their hearts, knowing that they might never see them again. Gorgo, the queen, stood beside her husband as he made his choices, her presence a reminder of what they were fighting for. Not just for Greece, not just for freedom, but for the right of their wives and daughters to walk unafraid beneath the sun, to raise their children in a world where virtue was valued above gold and courage above comfort. The sun was high in the sky when the last of the 300 was chosen. They stood in formation, their shields overlapping like the scales of some great bronze serpent, their spears pointed toward the sky like the teeth of the gods themselves. They were not young men, these chosen warriors. Most were in their 30s, some even older, men who had wives waiting at home and children who would grow up with only stories of their father's courage. But youth, Leonidas knew, was not what this battle required. What it required was the kind of courage that could only be forged in the fires of experience, the kind of wisdom that could only be earned through years of standing in the line of battle, the kind of love that could only be found in the hearts of men who had something worth dying for. As the 300 prepared to march, the priests of the city performed the sacred rituals, reading the omens in the flight of birds and the patterns of smoke that rose from the sacrificial fires. The signs were mixed, they said, speaking of great glory and great sorrow, of victory and defeat intertwined like lovers in the dark. But Leonidas paid little attention to the mutterings of the priests. He had already read the only omen that mattered in the eyes of his men, and what he saw there was not the promise of victory, but something far more precious, the unshakable resolve of free men who had chosen to stand against the tide of history itself. The preparations took 3 days. Armor was polished until it gleamed like starlight, weapons were sharpened to a razor's edge, and prayers were offered to the gods of war and wisdom. The 300 spent their last nights at home, holding their wives and children close, memorizing the feel of their touch and the sound of their voices, storing up memories like treasures to carry with them into the darkness. And when the dawn of the 4th day broke over the mountains of Sparta, the 300 were ready. They stood in the courtyard of the palace, their red cloaks flowing like blood in the morning breeze, their bronze shields catching the light like fragments of the sun itself. They were no longer just men, but something more, the living embodiment of an idea, the flesh and blood manifestation of the dream, that some things are worth more than life itself. As they marched through the gates of Sparta, the entire city turned out to see them off. Children threw flowers at their feet, old men raised their arms in blessing, and the women sang the ancient songs of war and glory. But beneath the celebration, everyone understood that they were witnessing something that would never be seen again. The last march of the 300, the final act of a drama that had been written in the stars since the world began. The morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson as the 300 began their march toward destiny. Behind them, the walls of Sparta grew smaller with each step, until they were just a memory on the horizon, a dream of home that would sustain them through the trials ahead. Before them stretched the sacred road to Thermopylae, winding through valleys where wildflowers bloomed like scattered jewels, and over hills where the wind carried the scent of pine and wild thyme. But this was no ordinary march, no simple movement of soldiers from one place to another. This was a pilgrimage, a journey through the very heart of Greece, through lands where every stone held the memory of heroes, and every stream whispered the names of the fallen. As they walked, the 300 were joined by others, a handful of Thespians who had volunteered to stand with them, some Theban hostages whose loyalty was questionable but whose courage was not, and the 700 Thespians who would prove that heroism was not the exclusive domain of Sparta. The road wound through the pass of Kithaeron, where the morning mist clung to the mountainsides like the breath of sleeping gods. Here, in these ancient hills, the heroes of old had walked before them. Theseus, who had slain the Minotaur in the labyrinth of Crete. Hercules, who had performed his 12 labors for the glory of all mankind. Perseus, who had faced the Gorgon and lived to tell the tale. The very stones seemed to whisper their names, and the 300 walked with the weight of that legacy on their shoulders. As they descended into the valley of Boeotia, the landscape changed around them. The harsh beauty of the Spartan mountains gave way to gentler hills covered with olive groves and vineyards, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the air was thick with the drone of bees and the scent of ripening grapes. This was the heart of Greece, the land that had given birth to democracy and philosophy, to art and poetry, to all the beautiful dreams that made life worth living. In the small villages they passed, the people came out to watch them march. Old men who had fought in the wars of their youth stood silent in the doorways, their eyes bright with unshed tears. Children pointed and whispered, not understanding what they were seeing, but sensing somehow that history was walking past their homes. Women threw flowers at their feet and called out blessings, their voices carrying on the wind like the songs of sirens. But perhaps the most moving sight was the young men who tried to join them. In every village, boys barely old enough to hold a spear stepped forward, their eyes burning with the desire to march with the 300 to immortality. Some were sons of farmers, others the children of merchants or craftsmen, but all were united by the same wild dream of glory that had stirred in the hearts of young men since the world began. Leonidas turned them all away, gently but firmly. This was not a battle for the young and untested, he told them. This was a task for men who had already proven themselves, who had already given their youth to the service of their cities. Let them stay and guard their homes. Let them live to fight another day when the tide of war had turned and Greece had need of their courage. As the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the 300 made camp in a grove of ancient oaks, their branches twisted into fantastic shapes by centuries of wind and weather. They built their fires small and close to the ground, not from fear of being seen, but from the simple practicality of soldiers who knew that every stick of wood might be precious in the days to come. Around the fires they shared their simple meal of bread and cheese, of wine mixed with water in the proper proportions. They spoke little, these men who were marching toward death, but when they did speak it was not of battle or strategy, but of the small things that make life precious, the taste of their wife's cooking, the sound of their children's laughter, the way the light fell across their olive groves in the early morning. Dinekes, ever the wit, told stories that made his companions laugh despite the weight of their mission. He spoke of a dog he had once owned, so lazy that it would rather starve than walk to its food bowl, and of a horse so stubborn that it would only move backward, making every journey an adventure in navigation. His words were a gift to his brothers, a reminder that even in the shadow of death there was still room for joy. As the night deepened and the fires burned low, Leonidas walked among his men, checking on their needs, sharing a word here and there with those who seemed troubled. He found Alpheus and Maron, the twin brothers, sitting apart from the others, their faces reflecting the flickering light of the dying flames. "My king," Alpheus said, rising to his feet, "we have been thinking about tomorrow, about the battle that awaits us. We are not afraid to die, but we wonder, will our sacrifice mean anything? Will the songs that are sung of us be worth the silence that will follow?" Leonidas looked at the two brothers, these men who had stood with him through a dozen battles, who had never asked for anything but the honor of serving their city. "Listen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "Long after our bones have turned to dust, long after our names are forgotten by all but the gods themselves, men will still speak of what we did at Thermopylae. They will tell their children, and their children's children, of the day when 300 Spartans stood against the might of an empire and refused to yield. They will remember that free men, fighting for their homes and their honor, are worth more than all the gold in the Persian treasury." The brothers nodded, satisfied with their king's words, and settled back into their quiet contemplation. Around them, the camp grew still as the 300 prepared for sleep, their thoughts turning to the narrow pass that lay ahead, to the destiny that awaited them in the hot gates of Thermopylae. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance. the same stars that had watched over heroes since the dawn of time. And somewhere in that vast tapestry of light, the gods themselves were watching, waiting to see what mortal men would do when faced with the ultimate choice between life and glory, between survival and immortality. The sacred road stretched ahead, leading toward a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, where the fate of the world would be decided not by the size of armies or the sharpness of swords, but by the courage that beats in the hearts of free men who have chosen to stand against the darkness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pass of Thermopylae as the 300 crested the final hill and beheld their destination. Before them lay the narrow corridor between mountain and sea that would become their tomb and their temple, their grave and their altar of sacrifice. The Hot Gates, the Greeks called it, named for the sulphurous springs that bubbled up from the earth like the breath of the underworld itself. It was a place that seemed carved by the gods for the very purpose they had come to fulfill. The pass was barely wide enough for 2 chariots to travel abreast, hemmed in on one side by cliffs that rose like the walls of Titans, and on the other by marshes and sea that stretched to the horizon. Here, the advantage of numbers would count for nothing. Here, 300 men with courage in their hearts and bronze in their hands could hold back the tide of empire itself. But they were not alone in this narrow defile. The advance guard of the Greek alliance had already arrived, 700 Thespians, brave men from a small city who had volunteered to stand with Sparta in her hour of need. 400 Thebans, their loyalty questionable, but their presence necessary for the politics of war, and scattered companies from other cities, men who had answered the call to arms and marched to their destiny in the shadow of the mountains. As the 300 descended into the pass, they were met by the Spartan commander who had arrived before them, a grizzled veteran named Dithyrambos, whose scars told stories of battles fought in distant lands. His report was brief and to the point. The Persian fleet had been sighted off the coast, their ships darkening the sea like a forest of masts. The land army was still days away, but advance scouts had already probed the pass, taking the measure of the ground where the fate of Greece would be decided. Leonidas surveyed the terrain with the eye of a soldier who had spent his life studying the art of war. The pass was indeed narrow, but it was not impassable. There were goat paths through the mountains, known to the local inhabitants, that could allow a small force to outflank the Greek position. These paths would have to be watched, guarded by men who understood that the fate of the entire army rested on their vigilance. The afternoon was spent in preparation. The 300 worked alongside their allies to build a wall across the narrowest point of the pass, using stones that seemed to have been placed there by the gods themselves for this very purpose. It was not a high wall, barely chest-high to a standing man, but it was enough to break the charge of cavalry and force the Persian infantry to climb over obstacles while Greek spears waited to greet them. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the first Persian herald arrived. He rode a magnificent horse, its mane braided with gold and its hooves shod with silver, and his armor gleamed like starlight in the dying light. He was a man of evident nobility, his bearing proud and his voice trained in the arts of diplomacy. "I come from Xerxes, King of Kings, Lord of all nations, Shadow of God upon earth," the herald announced, his voice carrying across the pass like the toll of a bronze bell. "My master offers you terms of honor. Surrender now, lay down your arms, and you will be treated as honored guests. Your cities will be spared, your families protected. You will be given lands in the far provinces of the empire, where you can live in peace and prosperity under the benevolent rule of the great king." The silence that followed was deeper than the grave. The 300 stood in their red cloaks, like statues carved from bronze and stone, their faces showing no emotion. their eyes fixed on the herald with the intensity of hawks watching their prey. Behind them, the other Greeks waited for their response, knowing that the next word spoken would determine the fate of not just their army, but their civilization itself. Leonidas stepped forward, his movement as fluid as water, as inevitable as the tide. He was not a large man, nor particularly imposing in his appearance, but when he spoke, his words carried the authority of one who had never known defeat and never would. "Tell your master," he said, his voice calm and measured, "that we thank him for his generous offer, but we did not come here to negotiate. We came here to fight. We came here to show the world that free men, fighting for their homes and their honor, are worth more than all the slaves in his empire." The herald's face showed no expression, but his eyes flickered with what might have been respect. "The great king has 1,000,000 men," he said quietly. "What hope do your few hundred have against such odds?" Leonidas smiled, and in that smile was all the terrible beauty of a warrior who had made peace with his mortality. "We have hope," he said, "because we fight not for gold or conquest, but for something that your master, for all his wealth and power, will never understand. We fight for the right to live as free men, to speak our minds without fear, to worship our gods as we choose. These are gifts more precious than all the treasures in your royal treasury." The herald bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. "I will carry your words to my master," he said, "but know this. When the sun rises tomorrow, the might of the Persian Empire will fall upon you like a mountain. You will have one last chance to reconsider." As the herald rode away, disappearing into the gathering darkness, the 300 prepared for their final night on earth. They polished their weapons until they gleamed like stars, braided their hair in the Spartan fashion, and made their peace with the gods. Some wrote letters to their wives and children, words of love and farewell that would be carried home by the few who might survive the coming storm. Others simply sat in silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, and remembering the taste of their mother's bread, the sound of their children's laughter, the way the light fell across their olive groves in the early morning. But all of them, in their own way, were preparing for the transformation that awaited them. Tomorrow they would cease to be merely men and become something more, legends written in letters of fire across the scroll of history, heroes whose names would be remembered as long as men valued courage over comfort and honor over life itself. The night deepened around them, and in the darkness the 300 of Sparta kept their vigil, knowing that when the sun rose, they would face the greatest army the world had ever assembled. But they were not afraid. They had chosen their path, and they would walk it to the end, whatever that end might be. For they were Spartans, and they would show the world what free men could accomplish when they stood together against the darkness. The first light of dawn crept across the waters of the Malian Gulf, like fingers of pale fire, touching the peaks of the mountains and casting long shadows across the pass of Thermopylae. In that liminal hour between night and day, when the world holds its breath and even the wind falls silent, the 300 of Sparta prepared for battle. They had slept little, these men who stood at the threshold of immortality. Some had spent the night in prayer, offering their hopes and fears to the gods of war and wisdom. Others had written letters to their loved ones, words of farewell that would be carried home by messengers who might survive the coming storm. But most had simply sat in silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, and preparing their hearts for what was to come. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the mist began to lift from the mountains, revealing the Persian host in all its terrible magnificence. They came like a river of bronze and steel, flowing through the passes of the mountains and spreading across the plain behind the hot gates like a sea of humanity. The sound of their approach was like thunder that would not end, the tramp of 1,000,000 feet, the creak of leather and bronze, the whinny of horses and the rumble of wheels, that shook the very foundations of the earth. At their head rode Xerxes himself, seated upon a throne of gold and ivory carried by bearers, whose muscles strained under the weight of their burden. He was a man of imposing presence, his dark eyes holding the accumulated wisdom and cruelty of a dozen conquered nations. His robes were purple as the depths of the sea, his crown set with gems that caught the morning light like captured stars. When he raised his hand, the vast army behind him came to a halt, their sudden silence more ominous than their thunder had been. From his elevated position, Xerxes could see the Greek forces arrayed across the narrow pass. Such a pitiful sight they must have seemed to his eyes, accustomed as he was to the vast pageantry of empire. A few hundred men in bronze armor, their red cloaks fluttering in the morning breeze like drops of blood against the grey stone of the mountains. Yet something in their bearing, in the way they stood shoulder to shoulder behind their wall of shields, gave him pause. These were not the cowering peasants he had expected to find. These were warriors, bred for battle, shaped by a culture that valued death before dishonor. As he watched, one of them stepped forward from the ranks, a man whose very presence seemed to command the respect of gods and mortals alike. Leonidas, king of Sparta, heir to a throne that had been won with bronze and blood rather than gold and diplomacy. The Spartan king raised his spear toward the sky, and his voice carried across the pass with the clarity of a bronze bell. "Persian," he called, his words echoing off the cliffs like the voice of prophecy itself. "Your herald spoke truly when he said you have 1,000,000 men, but numbers alone do not win battles. We have something your empire, for all its vastness, lacks, the courage of free men fighting for their homes." A murmur ran through the Persian ranks, translated into a dozen languages as the words passed from mouth to mouth. Some laughed at the audacity of this handful of Greeks who dared to challenge the might of empire. Others felt a chill run down their spines, for there was something in the Spartan's voice that spoke of destiny and doom intertwined. Xerxes himself felt the weight of those words, though he showed no sign of it on his face. He had conquered nations, had seen kings kneel before his throne and emperors beg for mercy. But there was something different about these men, something that reminded him uncomfortably of the oracle's prophecy that had haunted his dreams. When the lion of the west meets the eagle of the east, the very foundations of the world will shake. The great king gestured to his herald, who rode forward carrying a banner of white silk. His message was brief and to the point: surrender now and live as honored guests of the empire. Refuse and face the consequences of defying the will of the King of Kings. The answer came not in words, but in action. The 300 moved as one, their shields locking together with a sound like thunder, their spears lowering until they formed a hedge of bronze points that glittered in the morning sun. Behind them the other Greeks followed suit, 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans who had chosen to stand with Sparta in her hour of destiny. The sight was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Less than 2,000 men, standing against an army that stretched to the horizon. Yet there was something in their bearing, in the way they stood ready to face death without flinching, that made even the most hardened Persian veterans shift uncomfortably in their ranks. Xerxes raised his hand, and the order rippled through his army like a stone cast into still water. The Immortals, his elite guard of 10,000 men whose ranks were never allowed to diminish, began to march forward. They were the finest soldiers in the Persian army, veterans of a dozen campaigns, men whose loyalty to their king was absolute and whose courage had never been questioned. They came in perfect formation, their scaled armor gleaming like the hide of some great serpent, their faces hidden behind masks of bronze and gold. Their shields bore the image of the winged sun, symbol of Ahura Mazda, the god of light who watched over the Persian Empire. Their spears were longer than those of the Greeks. their bows capable of sending arrows farther than any weapon in the world. But as they approached the narrow mouth of the pass, something unexpected happened. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against them, forcing their perfect formations to compress and tangle as they tried to navigate the rocky ground. What had been a disciplined advance became a crowded mass of men struggling to maintain their order in the confined space. And there, waiting for them behind their wall of stone and bronze, stood the 300. They had chosen their ground well, these Spartans. In the narrow pass, the Persian advantage of numbers counted for nothing. Only a few dozen men at a time could come within reach of the Greek spears, and those who did found themselves facing warriors who had trained for this moment their entire lives. The first clash of bronze on bronze rang out across the pass like the tolling of a great bell, and the Battle of Thermopylae began. It was not the swift victory that Xerxes had expected, nor the glorious last stand that the Greeks had prepared for. It was something else entirely, a grinding, brutal test of will and endurance that would last for 3 days and nights, a crucible in which heroes would be forged and legends born. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the cliffs gold and casting deep shadows across the battlefield, the fate of two civilizations hung in the balance. The unstoppable force of empire had met the immovable object of Greek defiance, and the very foundations of the world were beginning to shake. The sun climbed toward its zenith, and with it came the first true test of the Greek resolve. The immortals had been repulsed, their perfect formations broken on the rocks of Thermopylae like waves against an unyielding shore. Now Xerxes called forward his Scythian archers, men from the vast steppes beyond the Black Sea, whose bows could send death flying farther than any weapon known to man. Picture them, if you will, as they took their positions on the slopes above the pass. Wild men with wind-burned faces and hands stained by the sinews of their bows, their arrows fletched with the feathers of eagles and hawks that soared over the endless grasslands of their homeland. They had learned their craft hunting wolves and bears across the steppes, where a missed shot meant starvation and a steady hand meant survival. The order came like the whisper of wind through grass, and suddenly the sky grew dark. 10,000 arrows rose in perfect unison, their bronze points catching the sunlight like a constellation of falling stars. They flew in a high arc over the battlefield, then began their deadly descent toward the Greek lines, hissing through the air like the breath of dragons. It was then that Dieneces, the wit of the Spartan army, proved that even in the face of death, a free man could find cause for laughter. As the arrows blotted out the sun above them, he turned to his companion with a grin and said, "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." His words passed through the ranks like ripples on water, and despite the deadly rain falling from above, the Greeks began to laugh. The arrows struck like hail upon their bronze shields, the sound ringing across the pass like the hammering of 1,000 smiths. Some found their mark, slipping between the joints of armor to draw blood from Greek flesh. But the 300 had trained for this moment, had practiced the ancient art of fighting beneath the bronze canopy of their overlocked shields. They moved as one organism, each man protecting his neighbor, the whole greater than the sum of its parts. When the storm of arrows finally ceased, the Greeks still stood. Their shields were bristling with shafts like the quills of enormous porcupines, their armor dented and scored but not broken. They had passed the first test, had shown that neither the elite immortals nor the deadly rain of Scythian arrows could break their resolve. But Xerxes was not finished. From his throne of gold and ivory, he watched the battle unfold with the detached interest of a god observing the struggles of mortals. He had other weapons in his vast arsenal, other nations whose warriors would test the mettle of these stubborn Greeks. With a gesture of his jeweled hand, he summoned the Sake horse archers from the eastern borders of his empire, men who could ride and shoot with equal skill. They came like a wind from the desert, their horses' hooves drumming against the earth in a rhythm as old as time itself. These were the descendants of the warriors who had once challenged Alexander's father in the lands beyond the Oxus, men who lived and died in the saddle, for whom the bow was as natural as breathing. But here in the narrow confines of Thermopylae, their mobility counted for nothing. The rocky ground and narrow space of the pass forced them to dismount and fight on foot, reducing them to common infantry, facing the finest heavy troops in the world. One by one they fell to the long spears of the Greeks, their curved bows useless in the press of close combat. As the afternoon wore on, Xerxes sent wave after wave of his best troops against the Greek position. Medes with their flowing robes and curved swords, Assyrians with their iron-scaled armor and massive shields, Bactrians from the roof of the world whose weapons gleamed with the cold fire of mountain steel. Each attack broke against the bronze wall of the Greek phalanx like water against stone. The 300 fought with the precision of a machine and the fury of wild beasts. Their spears thrust and withdrew in perfect unison, each man knowing exactly where his companions stood. Each movement calculated to maximize the deadly efficiency of their formation. When a spear broke, it was instantly replaced. When a man fell, his place was taken without hesitation. They were no longer individual warriors, but part of something greater, the living embodiment of an idea that some things are worth more than life itself. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Persian attacks finally ceased. The pass was littered with the bodies of the fallen, Persian and Mede and Sake, piled like driftwood at the base of the Greek wall. The survivors limped back to their lines, their confidence shattered, their certainty in the invincibility of their vast army beginning to crack like pottery in a kiln. That night, as the Persian army licked its wounds and tried to understand how a handful of Greeks had withstood the might of empire, the 300 tended to their own casualties. They had lost men, good men whose names would be remembered in the halls of Sparta long after their bones had turned to dust. But they had also proven something that would echo through the ages, that free men, fighting for their homes and their honor, were worth more than any number of slaves driven by the whip of tyranny. Leonidas walked among his men as the stars appeared overhead, checking on the wounded, sharing a word of encouragement here and there with those who seemed troubled by the day's carnage. He found young Lysander, barely 20 and fighting in his first major battle, sitting apart from the others and staring at the blood that stained his spear point. "Regrets, boy?" the king asked gently, settling down beside the young warrior. Lysander looked up, his eyes reflecting the light of the cooking fires. "No regrets, my king. Only I had not expected it to be so." He searched for the words. "So real," Leonidas finished. "So far from the glorious songs the poets sing. War is not beautiful, Lysander. It is necessary sometimes, but never beautiful. The beauty lies in what we fight for, not in the fighting itself." The young man nodded, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. Around them, the 300 settled in for another night, knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, new tests of their resolve. But they were not afraid. They had chosen their path, and they would walk it to the end, whatever that end might be. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, the same stars that had watched over Troy and Marathon, over all the great battles where heroes had stood against the darkness. And somewhere in that vast tapestry of light, the gods themselves were watching, waiting to see what mortal men would do when faced with the ultimate choice between survival and glory. The second day dawned grey and cold, with clouds hanging low over the mountains like the breath of sleeping titans. The morning mist clung to the battlefield, shrouding the bodies of the fallen in a ghostly veil that seemed to muffle sound and blur the boundaries between the living and the dead. It was a day that seemed made for endings, for final acts and ultimate sacrifices. From his pavilion of silk and gold, Xerxes watched the mist swirl around the pass of Thermopylae and felt the first stirrings of something he had not experienced since childhood: doubt. The finest soldiers in his army had broken themselves against the bronze wall of Greek shields like waves against a cliff. The Immortals, his personal guard whose courage and skill had never been questioned, had been repulsed with losses that made even hardened veterans whisper of ill omens and angry gods. But the great king had not conquered half the world by yielding to doubt. With the dawn came new orders, carried by heralds whose voices rang across the Persian camp like the call of war horns. The Immortals would attack again, but this time they would be supported by the full might of the Persian war machine. Engineers would clear the approaches to the Greek wall, sappers would undermine their position, and archers would maintain a constant rain of arrows to keep the defenders pinned down. As the sun burned away the morning mist, the true scale of the Persian army was revealed in all its terrifying magnificence. They stretched across the plain behind the pass like a sea of bronze and steel, their banners fluttering in the morning breeze like the wings of predatory birds. Elephants from distant India swayed in their ranks, their tusks sharpened to deadly points, their thick hides armored with bronze scales. War chariots from Egypt and Assyria waited in perfect formation, their wheels fitted with scythe blades that could cut down infantry like wheat before the sickle. But here, in the narrow confines of Thermopylae, all of this vast military might was useless. The elephants could not charge through the rocky defile, the chariots could not maneuver in the confined space, and the advantage of numbers was negated by the simple geography of the battlefield. Only a few dozen men at a time could come within reach of the Greek spears, and those who did found themselves facing warriors who had been bred for this moment. The attack began with another storm of arrows, darker and denser than the day before. The Scythian archers had been reinforced by companies of Persian bowmen, whose composite bows could drive arrows through bronze at close range. The sky grew black with their shafts, and for long minutes the only sound in the pass was the whistle of arrows and the ring of bronze on bronze as they struck the Greek shields. But when the storm finally ceased, the 300 still stood. Their shields were punctured and dented, their armor scored by glancing blows, but their line remained unbroken. They had learned the rhythm of Persian warfare, had adapted their tactics to meet each new challenge. Now they crouched behind their wall like bronze statues, their spears ready, their eyes fixed on the narrow opening where their enemies would come. The Immortals advanced again, 10,000 strong, their scaled armor gleaming like the hide of some mythical beast. They had put aside their bows and taken up their spears, determined to meet the Greeks in the kind of close combat where Persian steel had never failed to triumph. Their officers rode before them on white horses, their voices raised in battle songs that had been old when Babylon was young. But as they entered the mouth of the pass, the same thing happened as on the previous day. Their perfect formation compressed and tangled, their numerical advantage becoming a liability in the confined space. The first ranks pressed forward, driven by the weight of men behind them, only to meet the hedge of Greek spears that waited like the teeth of a bronze trap. The clash when it came was like the meeting of two bronze mountains. The front ranks of the Immortals crashed against the Greek wall with a sound that echoed off the cliffs like thunder, their spears seeking gaps in the enemy line, their shields locked in the deadly push that would determine which side would hold and which would break. For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance. The Immortals were the finest soldiers in the Persian army, veterans who had conquered nations and never known defeat. They pushed forward with the fury of men fighting for their honor, their cries rising to the heavens like the voices of demons. Behind them, fresh troops pressed forward, adding their weight to the assault, threatening to overwhelm the Greeks by the sheer mass of their numbers. But the 300, had trained their entire lives for this moment. They knew the art of close combat as other men knew the ploughing of fields or the tending of vines. Their spears found the gaps between Persian shields with the precision of surgeons' knives, their bronze points drinking deep of enemy blood. When the press became too great, they gave ground slowly, step by step, drawing the Persians deeper into the narrow space where their numbers meant nothing. And then, at the moment when victory seemed within Persian grasp, Leonidas gave the signal. The Greeks suddenly contracted their line, pulling back from the wall they had defended so stubbornly, seeming to retreat in the face of Persian pressure. The Immortals surged forward, thinking they had finally broken the enemy resolve, their officers crying out in triumph as they poured through the gap. It was a trap. As the Persians crowded into the narrow space behind the wall, the Greeks wheeled and struck them from both flanks. The carefully ordered advance became a confused melee, with Persian fighting Persian in the crush, as Greek spears thrust from every direction. The Immortals, caught in a space too narrow for their numbers, became their own worst enemy as they struggled to bring their weapons to bear. The slaughter was terrible and swift. Persian blood stained the rocks red, and the cries of dying men echoed off the cliffs like the wails of the damned. Those Immortals who could try to retreat, but the press of men behind them made withdrawal impossible. They died where they stood, these elite warriors who had thought themselves invincible, their scaled armor no protection against the fury of free men fighting for their homes. When the carnage finally ended, nearly half the Immortals lay dead in the narrow space behind the wall. The survivors limped back to their lines, their confidence shattered, their faith in their own invincibility broken like pottery against stone. For the first time in memory, the elite guard of the Persian king had been defeated, their proud banners trampled in the dust of Thermopylae. From his throne of gold and ivory, Xerxes watched the retreat of his finest troops with eyes that showed no emotion, but his hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles showed white beneath the skin. Twice now, the Greeks had repulsed his attacks. Twice they had shown that all the gold in his treasury could not buy the kind of courage that came from fighting for freedom. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky blood red, the great king pondered his options. He had other troops, other nations to call upon, but for the first time since the beginning of his great campaign, he began to wonder if there was something in these western lands that his vast empire could not conquer, something that all his wealth and power could not overcome. The night fell like a shroud over the battlefield, and in the darkness the 300 kept their vigil, knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh trials. But they had survived the second day, had proven once again that free men, fighting for something greater than themselves, were worth more than any number of slaves driven by the whip of tyranny. On the third morning, as the first pale light of dawn crept across the waters of the Malian Gulf, a different kind of shadow fell across the camp of the 300. It came not from the Persian army that stretched like a dark sea beyond the mouth of the pass, but from the mountains themselves, from the treacherous paths that wound through the cliffs like the tracks of some great serpent. Ephialtes. Even now, 25 centuries later, the name falls from the lips like a curse, like the sound of bronze breaking or the cry of a dying man. He was a Malian, a local man who knew every goat path and deer track in the mountains around Thermopylae. And on this morning, driven by dreams of Persian gold or perhaps by simple cowardice, he had made his way to the tent of Xerxes with information that would change the course of history. The path existed, he told the great king, his voice trembling with the weight of his betrayal. An ancient track used by shepherds and smugglers, winding through the high peaks and emerging behind the Greek position. A small force moving by night could use this path to outflank the defenders and attack them from both sides. The narrow pass that had been the Greeks' greatest strength would become their tomb. Xerxes listened to the traitor's words with the attention of a hunter, hearing the first rustle in the undergrowth that betrays the presence of his prey. He had been searching for exactly such an opportunity, some way to break the deadlock that had cost him so many of his finest soldiers. Now, delivered into his hands by this miserable creature who sold his neighbors' lives for foreign gold, was the key to victory. The great king summoned Hydarnes, one of his most trusted generals, a man whose loyalty was absolute, and whose skill in mountain warfare was legendary. To him was given command of the immortals who remained, the survivors of the previous day's slaughter, and their mission was simple. Follow the mountain path, emerge behind the Greek lines, and crush the defenders between hammer and anvil. But the Greeks were not blind to the danger. Leonidas had posted a guard on the mountain path, 1,000 Phocians whose knowledge of the local terrain made them the logical choice for this vital task. They had built a wall across the narrowest point of the track and settled in to wait, confident that they could hold any force that tried to force the passage. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Phocians were brave men, but they were not Spartans. They had not spent their lives preparing for the moment when death would come calling, had not been bred in the harsh school of Lacedaemonian discipline. When the Persian force appeared out of the morning mist, like a nightmare made manifest, their nerve failed them at the crucial moment. The immortals, stung by their previous defeats and eager to restore their reputation, fell upon the Phocian position with the fury of men who had something to prove. The mountain air rang with the clash of bronze on bronze, the cries of wounded men, and the terrible sound of arrows finding their mark in flesh and bone. The Phocians fought bravely at first, but as the Persian numbers began to tell and their wall was finally overrun, panic took hold. Some fled deeper into the mountains, hoping to find safety in the trackless peaks. Others tried to make their way back to warn the main Greek force, but the Persian cavalry was faster, their arrows more accurate than desperate running feet. Most never made it past the first bend in the path, their bodies left to feed the ravens and wolves that made their homes in the high places. But one man did escape. A young Phocian named Tirastiades, fleet of foot and wise enough to know the mountain paths better than his enemies, managed to slip through the Persian net as dawn was breaking over the peaks. He ran like a man possessed, leaping from rock to rock with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, driven by the knowledge that the fate of Greece might depend on the speed of his feet and the strength of his lungs. He reached the Greek camp as the sun was climbing toward its zenith, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his tunic torn by thorns and stones, his eyes bright with the terrible knowledge he carried. The words tumbled from his lips like water from a broken dam. The mountain path had fallen, the Persians were coming, the trap was closing around them all. The news spread through the Greek ranks like wildfire, and with it came the moment of ultimate choice. They could retreat now while the path was still open, could withdraw to fight another day when the odds were more favorable. No one would blame them. They had already done more than duty required, had held the pass for 2 days against impossible odds. Honor had been satisfied, courage proven, glory earned. But that was not the Spartan way. Leonidas gathered his captains around him in the shadow of the wall they had built with their own hands, and in voices quiet as the whisper of wind through olive leaves, they discussed their options. The allied contingents could withdraw, should withdraw. There was no shame in tactical retreat when faced with an impossible situation, but the 300 would stay. The decision, when it came, was inevitable as sunrise, as certain as the tide. The Thespians, those brave men from a small city who had volunteered to stand with Sparta, chose to remain as well. 700 men who could have fled to safety, but chose instead to stand with their Spartan brothers in their hour of destiny. The Thebans, their loyalty already questionable, were kept as hostages, though whether they would fight or flee when the moment came remained to be seen. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the pass, the remaining Greeks made their preparations for the final act of the drama. They knew now that this was not a battle they could win, but a last stand they could make glorious. They combed their hair in the Spartan fashion, braided with care as if they were preparing for a festival rather than a funeral. They polished their weapons until they gleamed like starlight, checked their armor one last time, and made their peace with whatever gods watched over the souls of warriors. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains when the Persian flanking force finally appeared on the heights behind the Greek position. They came like shadows made flesh, their armor dark against the evening sky, their spears glinting with the last light of day. The trap was closing, the jaws of destiny drawing together around the narrow pass where legends would be born and heroes would die. But the 300 were ready. They had always known this moment would come, had accepted it the day they left Sparta with flowers at their feet and songs of glory on their lips. They stood now in their final formation, their shields locked together like the scales of some great bronze beast, their spears pointing toward both ends of the pass where their enemies waited. The last battle of Thermopylae was about to begin, and with it, the transformation of mortal men into immortal legend. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the cliffs of Thermopylae in shades of gold and crimson, when the final act of the great drama began to unfold. The Persian flanking force had emerged from the mountain paths like a dark tide, flowing down the slopes to take position behind the Greek lines. The trap was complete now, the jaws of destiny closing around the narrow pass where 300 Spartans had chosen to make their stand against eternity. Leonidas stood before his men in the dying light, his bronze armor catching the last rays of the sun like captured fire. Around him, the 300 waited in perfect silence, their red cloaks flowing in the evening breeze like drops of blood against the grey stone of the mountains. They knew what was coming, had always known from the moment they left Sparta, with flowers at their feet and glory in their hearts. "My brothers," the king said, his voice carrying across the pass with the clarity of bronze bells, "the hour of our destiny is upon us. We came here not to win a battle, but to buy time with our lives, to show the world that free men fighting for their homes and their honor are worth more than all the slaves in the Persian Empire. That mission is nearly complete." He paused, looking into the faces of the men who had followed him to this narrow place between mountain and sea. These were not young men drunk on dreams of glory, but seasoned warriors who understood the weight of what they were about to do. Fathers and husbands, brothers and sons, men who had left everything they loved behind to stand in this desolate place and face the tide of empire. "Before this day is done," Leonidas continued, "our names will be written in letters of fire across the scroll of history. Long after our bones have turned to dust, men will still speak of what we did here. They will tell their children and their children's children of the day when 300 Spartans stood against the might of an empire and refused to yield. The silence that followed was deeper than the grave, heavier than the mountains that surrounded them. In that silence, each man made his own private peace with whatever gods he served. Each offered his own prayer to the mysteries that wait beyond the veil of mortal life. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared in the darkening heavens, the Persian attack began. They came from both directions now, flowing into the pass like twin rivers of bronze and steel. From the north, Xerxes himself led the assault, his surviving immortals marching in perfect formation behind him. From the south, Hydarnes and his mountain force descended like an avalanche of war, their weapons gleaming in the starlight. The 300 formed a circle now, their shields locked together like the petals of some deadly flower, their spears pointing outward toward the enemies who surrounded them. They had abandoned their wall, that barrier of stone and bronze that had served them so well in the previous day's fighting. Now they needed room to maneuver, space to sell their lives dearly in the final accounting. The first clash came like the meeting of thunderclouds, a sound that shook the very foundations of the mountains. Persian spears met Spartan shields in a crescendo of bronze and iron, and the narrow pass became a cauldron of violence that seemed to contain all the fury of the world. Men fought and died in the space of heartbeats, their cries rising to the heavens like the voices of the damned. But even surrounded and outnumbered 100 to 1, the Spartans fought with a precision and ferocity that turned their final stand into something approaching art. They moved as one organism, each man knowing exactly where his brothers stood, each shield movement calculated to protect the warrior beside him. When a spear broke, it was instantly replaced. When a man fell, his place was taken without hesitation. Dieneces, the wit of the army, died with a laugh on his lips, his last words a jest about the quality of Persian wine. Alpheus and Maron, the twin brothers, fell within moments of each other, their hands reaching out across the corpse-strewn ground to touch one final time. One by one, the heroes of Sparta gave their lives to the hungry gods of war, each death a poem written in bronze and blood. As the battle raged through the night, something extraordinary began to happen. The Persian attacks, which should have overwhelmed the tiny Greek force within minutes, began to falter and break against the bronze circle of Spartan shields. The very ferocity of the 300's resistance seemed to unnerve their enemies, as if they were fighting not mortal men but some force of nature that could not be conquered by conventional means. Xerxes himself, watching from his throne of gold and ivory, felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. These were not the actions of normal soldiers, not the desperate thrashing of men facing inevitable death. This was something else entirely, the final flowering of a warrior culture that valued honor above life and glory above breath itself. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, and still the battle raged. The circle of Spartans grew smaller with each passing hour, but it did not break. Even as their numbers dwindled and their strength began to fail, they maintained their formation, their discipline, their unwavering commitment to the ideal that had brought them to this desolate place. It was near dawn when Leonidas himself finally fell. He had been fighting at the center of the circle, his spear dripping with Persian blood, his voice raised in the ancient war cries of his people. A Persian arrow found the gap between his breastplate and shoulder guard, and he staggered, then dropped to one knee. But even as the life flowed out of him, he continued to fight, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision until the darkness finally claimed him. The death of their king seemed to fill the surviving Spartans with a terrible fury. They fought now not just for honor or glory, but for the chance to join their beloved leader in whatever realm awaited heroes beyond the veil of death. They carved their way through the Persian ranks with the fury of men who had transcended mortal fear, who had become something more than human in their final hour. When the sun finally rose over the mountains of Thermopylae, it illuminated a scene that would haunt the dreams of the Persian survivors for the rest of their lives. The narrow pass was carpeted with the dead Persian and Greek alike, their blood watering the rocky ground until it ran like crimson streams toward the sea. At the center of the carnage, arranged in a perfect circle like the petals of a bronze flower, lay the bodies of the 300. They had kept their promise, these warriors of Sparta. They had shown the world that free men, fighting for their homes and their honor, were worth more than all the gold in the Persian treasury. They had bought with their lives the time that Greece needed to prepare for the greater battles that lay ahead, and they had written their names in letters of fire across the scroll of history, ensuring that as long as men valued courage over comfort, their sacrifice would be remembered. The Battle of Thermopylae was over. The 300 were dead, but their legend had only just begun. In the grey light of dawn that followed the final battle, Xerxes walked among the dead, with the measured step of a man surveying the ruins of his own certainty. The narrow pass of Thermopylae lay before him like an open grave, carpeted with the bodies of warriors from both sides of the great divide that separated east from west, empire from freedom, the ancient world from the one that was struggling to be born. The great king moved in silence, his purple robe stirring in the morning breeze that carried the scent of blood and bronze across the battlefield. Behind him walked his generals and satraps, their faces reflecting the complex emotions of men who had witnessed something they could not fully understand. Yes, they had won. The pass was theirs, the road to the south lay open, and the Greek army that had defied them for 3 days was no more. But the victory felt hollow, tasted of ashes and regret. At the center of the carnage, Xerxes paused before the body of Leonidas. The Spartan king lay where he had fallen, his bronze armor dented and blood-stained, but still magnificent in the morning light. His face, peaceful in death, showed no trace of fear or regret, only the quiet satisfaction of a man who had fulfilled his destiny. Around him, arranged in their final formation, lay the bodies of the 300, their shields still locked together even in death. For a long moment, the King of Kings stood in contemplation, staring down at the man who had defied him with such magnificent futility. Here was the corpse of a king whose realm could be crossed in a single day, whose army had numbered in the hundreds rather than the millions, whose treasury could not have equipped a single regiment of Persian cavalry. Yet this dead man had accomplished something that all of Xerxes' vast wealth and power could not. He had become immortal. The irony was not lost on the Persian monarch. He who commanded the loyalty of 100 nations, who could speak a word and see cities rise or fall, who held the fate of millions in his jeweled hands, would someday be dust and forgotten memory. But this Spartan, this king of a small mountain city, would live forever in the songs of men, would be remembered as long as courage was valued and freedom cherished. A Persian officer approached, his armor still stained with the blood of the knights fighting. "Great king," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "what shall we do with the bodies of the enemy dead? Custom demands that we—" "Custom," Xerxes interrupted, his voice carrying a weight of weariness that had not been there 3 days before, "demands many things, but some men transcend custom just as they transcend death itself." He gestured toward the fallen Spartans with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. "These men fought like lions. They shall be buried like kings." The order spread through the Persian ranks like ripples on still water, and soon soldiers who had fought against the 300 were carefully gathering their bodies, treating them with the respect due to fallen heroes rather than defeated enemies. It was unprecedented, this honor shown to those who had died in defiance of the great king's will, but no man dared question the wisdom of Xerxes in this strange and solemn hour. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the morning mist that clung to the mountains like the breath of ghosts, the true cost of the victory began to reveal itself. The narrow pass was choked with Persian dead, men from every corner of the empire who had died in the attempt to break the bronze wall of Spartan shields. The immortals, that elite guard whose ranks were never supposed to diminish, had been decimated. Entire companies of the finest soldiers in the world had been reduced to scattered survivors who moved through the camp like men walking in a nightmare. But the physical casualties, terrible as they were, paled beside the deeper wound that had been inflicted on the Persian war machine. For 3 days, a handful of Greeks had held back the might of the greatest empire the world had ever known. They had shown that numbers alone do not determine the outcome of battles, that courage and conviction can triumph over vast material advantages, that free men fighting for their homes are worth more than any number of slaves driven by the whip of tyranny. Word of the battle spread through the Persian army like a plague, whispered in a dozen languages around 10,000 cooking fires. The men who had witnessed the final stand of the 300 spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices carrying a mixture of awe and unease. They had seen something at Thermopylae that challenged everything they believed about power and empire, about the inevitability of Persian victory. The subject peoples who made up the bulk of Xerxes' army began to look at their Greek enemies with new eyes. If a few hundred Spartans could hold the pass for 3 days, what might the combined armies of Greece accomplish when they finally stood together in battle? The whispers of doubt that had begun at Thermopylae would spread throughout the empire, weakening the bonds of loyalty and fear that held the vast structure together. Xerxes himself felt the change, though he showed no sign of it on his imperial features. The easy confidence that had carried him across the Hellespont was gone, replaced by something harder and more brittle. He had learned at Thermopylae that there were things in this western land that his empire could not conquer, spirits that could not be broken by force or bought with gold. As the Persian army prepared to resume its march south toward Athens, the great king took one last look at the narrow pass where so much blood had been spilled. A monument would be erected here, he decided, not to celebrate Persian victory, but to honor the courage of the men who had died. Let future generations remember what had happened at the Hot Gates. Let them understand that even in defeat, some victories are so magnificent that they transform the very nature of defeat itself. The column began to move, a river of bronze and steel flowing through the pass toward the heartland of Greece. But something had changed in that narrow defile between mountain and sea, something that could not be measured in casualties or tactical advantages. The myth of Persian invincibility had been shattered on the rocks of Thermopylae, and in its place had been born a legend that would outlast empires and kingdoms, that would inspire free men in every age to stand against the forces that would make them slaves. Behind them, the 300 kept their eternal vigil, their bronze shields reflecting the morning sun like mirrors of burnished gold. They had achieved their goal, these warriors of Sparta. They had bought with their lives the time that Greece needed to prepare for the greater battles ahead. But more than that, they had shown the world that some things are worth more than life itself, that honor and freedom are prices that cannot be calculated in gold or measured in the span of mortal years. The Battle of Thermopylae was over, but its echoes would ring through the ages, inspiring heroes yet unborn and reminding all who heard the tale that courage, once kindled in the human heart, burns with a flame that death itself cannot extinguish. Years have passed since that grey dawn, when the last of the 300 fell silent in the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Decades have turned to centuries, centuries to millennia, and still the story echoes through the corridors of time like the sound of bronze on bronze, like the whisper of wind through mountain passes, like the eternal song that freedom sings in the hearts of free men. Picture, if you will, the Greece that rose from the ashes of that sacrifice. The Persian fleet, mighty as it was, met its doom in the Straits of Salamis, where Athenian ships danced like dolphins around the clumsy vessels of empire. The great army of Xerxes, demoralized by the memory of Thermopylae, was crushed at Plataea by a united Greek force that fought with the fury of men who had learned that victory was possible. The tide of empire receded, leaving behind it the wreckage of dreams and the debris of broken chains. Athens entered its golden age, that brief and shining moment when democracy flowered like a garden in spring and the arts reached heights that still inspire wonder. Philosophers walked in marble halls, their minds grappling with questions that had never been asked before. Playwrights crafted tragedies that laid bare the human soul, and historians began to record the deeds of men with something approaching objective truth. All of this, in its way, was part of the legacy of the 300, part of the price they had paid with their lives at the hot gates. But the true measure of their sacrifice was not found in the victories that followed, nor in the golden ages that bloomed like flowers from the soil they had watered with their blood. No, the real meaning of Thermopylae lay deeper, in the realm of the spirit, in the eternal struggle between those who would be free and those who would make them slaves. Simonides the poet understood this when he composed the epitaph that would be carved in stone above their grave. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. 7 words in the ancient Greek, but in those 7 words was contained the essence of what they had died for. Not for personal glory, not for conquest or plunder, but for the simple right to live according to the laws they themselves had chosen, to walk free beneath the sun of their homeland, to raise their children in a world where virtue was valued above gold and courage above comfort. The monument that Xerxes had erected was eventually replaced by something simpler and more enduring, a small stone marker that bore those immortal words. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world to pay their respects, to stand in the narrow pass and try to understand what had driven 300 men to choose death over dishonor. Some were warriors themselves, seeking inspiration for their own battles. Others were fathers teaching their sons about the price of freedom, all left changed by what they found in that desolate place. As Greece gave way to Rome, and Rome to the barbarian kingdoms, and those in turn to new empires and new dreams, the story of Thermopylae lived on. Medieval knights sang of the 300 around their campfires, seeing in their sacrifice a reflection of their own codes of honor. Renaissance scholars rediscovered the ancient texts and marveled at the courage of men who had stood against impossible odds. Enlightenment philosophers found in the Spartan stand a perfect example of the eternal struggle between freedom and tyranny. In the New World, as colonists took up arms against an empire that would tax them without representation, they invoked the memory of Leonidas and his men. When Americans faced their own choice between liberty and submission, they remembered the narrow pass where 300 men had chosen to stand rather than kneel. The echo of bronze on bronze sounded again at Lexington and Concord, at Valley Forge and Yorktown, wherever free men took up arms to defend their right to govern themselves. And in the darkest hours of the modern age, when new forms of tyranny arose with weapons that would have seemed like magic to the warriors of ancient Greece, the story of Thermopylae provided inspiration for resistance. In the Warsaw Ghetto, in the mountains of occupied Europe, in 100 nameless places where small groups of brave men and women faced overwhelming odds, the spirit of the 300 lived on. They understood, these latter-day heroes, what Leonidas and his warriors had known in their hearts, that some fights are worth fighting even when victory seems impossible, that some principles are worth dying for even when the odds are hopeless, that courage, once kindled in the human heart, burns with a flame that neither time nor death can extinguish. For the 300 had achieved something far greater than military victory. They had shown that the human spirit, when tested to its limits, can transcend the boundaries of mortality and enter the realm of legend. They had proved that a few good men, standing together in a righteous cause, can change the course of history itself. As we drift now toward the end of our journey through time, toward the gentle embrace of sleep and dreams, let us remember what those ancient warriors taught us in that narrow pass between mountain and sea. Let us remember that freedom is not a gift that can be given or taken away by others, but a birthright that must be defended by each generation. Let us remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. And let us remember, in the quiet hours before dawn when the world seems darkest and hope feels like a dying ember, that somewhere in the realm of legend and memory, 300 Spartan warriors keep their eternal vigil. They stand forever in that narrow pass, their bronze shields reflecting the light of a sun that will never set, their spears pointed toward the darkness, their voices raised in the ancient cry that echoes through the ages, Molon Labe. Come and take them. Come and take our freedom, our honor, our right to live as free men beneath the stars. Come and try to break the bonds that tie us to our homes, our families, our sacred duty to those who will come after us. Come and discover what 300 Spartans learned in that narrow place called Thermopylae, that some things are more precious than life itself, and that courage, once kindled in the human heart, burns with a light that death cannot dim. Sleep now, weary traveler. Sleep and dream of bronze and glory, of heroes who chose immortality over breath, of a narrow pass where the fate of the world was decided by the courage of free men. Sleep and remember that their sacrifice was not in vain, that their legacy lives on in every heart that refuses to bow to tyranny, in every voice that speaks out against injustice, in every hand that reaches out to help the fallen rise again. The 300 of Sparta keep their watch still, guardians of the past between freedom and slavery, between honor and shame, between the light and the gathering dark. And as long as men remember their names and honor their sacrifice, that light will never fade, that past will never fall, and the dream of freedom will live forever in the hearts of those brave enough to defend it.